The Panama Canal.
Table of Contents: The Panama Canal.
All about the Panama Canal, with visiting and touring information, geography, history, attractions, and other points of interest.
Dr. Sydney Soclof. Dr. Sydney22@gmail.com. 2023. Narration by Dr. Sydney Soclof,
Zoe Funny,
and Nathan Coltove. For a complete discussion of YouTube navigation, please go to tiny.1/ytnavigator. The story of the Panama Canal.
The story of the Panama Canal, 1513 to 2016, 500 years of history, during most of which nothing much happened. All told in about 1 hour. A canal across Central America is of vital strategic interest to the U.S.
The Panama Canal must be a sea-level canal, like the one I built at Suez. Ferdinand de Lesseps. A canal for the glory of France. Vive la France.
I'll lose all my investment unless Congress votes for the Panama Route. Philippe Bonneau-Ferrella.
I have received my orders to build the canal. These orders will be carried out. General George Washington Goethals, Chief Engineer, 1907 to 1914. I have proven that yellow fever is carried by mosquitoes. Major Walter Reed. I have proven that malaria is carried by mosquitoes. Sir Ronald Ross, British bacteriologist, and winner of the Nobel Prize for Malaria in 1902.
These terrible diseases of malaria and yellow fever will be eradicated. Dr. William Goggins.
At one point during the U.S. effort, more than 40,000 worked on the canal route. About 25% were American, and the rest were mainly from Caribbean islands. The Panama Canal is a lock-type canal, now owned and administered by the Republic of Panama.
The overall cost of the canal was about $350 million. The largest and costliest work ever undertaken by the U.S. government. It became one of the world's premier feats of engineering.
The concrete lock chambers and mechanical lock gates were the largest ever built. At the time, Gatun Dam was the largest earthen dam ever built, forming the world's largest artificial lake.
Since opening, the canal has been enormously successful and continues to be a key conduit for international shipping. Over 1 million ships have passed through the canal.
The Panama Canal has had an enormous impact on shipping between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, eliminating the long and treacherous route via the Drake Passage and Cape Horn, at the southernmost tip of South America.
Panama Canal timeline: 1515 El Camino Real, 1848 the California Gold Rush, 1850 to 1855 the Panama Railway built, 1880 the French work begins, and in 1888 the French effort ends. 1903 Independence of Panama from Colombia. 1904 the Americans begin digging, and in 1914 the canal was completed. In 1999, the canal was transferred to Panama. And finally the expansion project was started in 2007 and completed in 2016. The Panama Canal connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the narrow Isthmus of Panama.
Ships sailing between the east and west coasts of the United States and Canada, which otherwise would have to go around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, shortened their voyage by about 9,000 miles by using the canal. A ship sailing from New York to San Francisco via the canal travels 6,000 miles. Well under half the distance of the previous 14,000-mile route around Cape Horn.
There is a similar saving in eliminating the transit around the southern tip of South America to go between European ports and the west coast of the US and Canada, and also for other transoceanic routes.
Ships sailing between Europe and East Asia or Australia can save as much as 2,000 miles by using the canal.
Savings of up to 4,000 miles are also made on voyages between one coast of North America and ports on the other side of South America.
A major impediment to travel around the southern tip of South America is the storm-tossed waters of the Drake Passage.
Perhaps the most turbulent wind-driven waters on Earth are the 600 miles between the southern tip of South America at Cape Horn and the Antarctic Peninsula.
This is the Drake Passage, named after Sir Francis Drake, who was one of the first to navigate these waters.
Here is the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which is the world's largest ocean current. It circulates in a clockwise or westerly direction at an average speed of about 1/2 of a mile per hour.
Here is the average wind speed over a period of 10 years. Looking at the region between the southern tip of South America and the Antarctic Peninsula, we note the great intensity of the wind speed.
Whereas over much of Europe and North America we have wind speeds in the 9 to 13 miles per hour range. Down in this region the wind speed averages 16 to 20 miles per hour. Here is a more detailed view of the Drake Passage between Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America and Antarctica.
It is this high wind speed and the ocean currents that make navigation around Cape Horn so very difficult. So, not only is the distance longer, but the voyage is much more hazardous and difficult.
There is a great Cordillera, or chain of mountains, throughout the length of North and South America, extending from above the Arctic Circle in northern Alaska to Terra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America.
This Cordillera begins with the Brooks Range in northern Alaska, then continues through the Canadian Rockies, the Rocky Mountains in the U.S., the Sierra Madre in Mexico, the mountains of Central America, and then the Andes of South America, all of the way down to Tierra del Fuego, at the southern tip of South America.
This shows Central America, with the narrow Isthmus of Panama, which is only 50 miles wide. To the south of Panama is the South American country of Colombia, and to the north is Costa Rica and Nicaragua.
We see that not only is the Isthmus of Panama the narrowest land between the oceans in all of the Americas,
but it is also the region of lowest elevation. These two factors are what drew early attention to this as a possible location for a transoceanic canal. The elevations in this region of the Isthmus of Panama are much lower than further to the east and north, where elevations up to 10,000 feet are encountered,
and to the east and south, with elevations in the range of 1,000 to 2,000 feet.
In the lowest and narrowest part of the isthmus, elevations are down to below 500 feet. Nevertheless, these elevations still posed a major challenge for building a canal. Note that the Panama Canal is mostly oriented north-south, and the entrance at the Atlantic Ocean is slightly to the west of the entrance on the Pacific Ocean side. Very full. A ship sailing from the Atlantic to the Pacific through the canal actually travels from northwest to southeast. The length of the Panama Canal from shoreline to shoreline is about 40 miles. And from deep water in the Atlantic, more specifically, the Caribbean Sea, to deep water in the Pacific is about 51 miles.
The Panama Canal is one of the two most strategic artificial waterways in the world, the other being the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal opened in 1869, connecting the Mediterranean Sea with the Red Sea, and thence to the Indian Ocean.
The Suez Canal shortens the route from Europe to Asia by eliminating the need to go around the southern tip of Africa. Here is a profile, or cross-sectional view, of the Panama Canal.
This cross-section shows the route of a ship through the Panama Canal.
It's 3 steps up from sea level at the Pacific side, to the level of Gatun Lake, and then 3 steps down to sea level, on the Atlantic side.
The height of ships must be raised and lowered in the locks and going between sea level at the Atlantic Ocean to the level of Gatun Lake. And from Gatun Lake down to the Pacific Ocean is 85 feet.
Ships entering from the Atlantic Ocean are raised 85 feet to the level of Gatun Lake by a series of 3 locks. At the end of Gatun Lake, the Gaillard Cut begins. Each of the 3 locks raises the ships by about 28 feet.
Almost 2/3 of the canal route, 32 miles out of the total of 51 miles, is actually across Gatun Lake,
formed by the damming of the Wild Shark Race River by the Gatun Dam. After Gatun Lake there is the Gaillard Cut, the narrowest section of the canal. The channel through the Gaillard Cut is 8 miles long and 490 feet wide. At the end of the Gaillard Cut are the locks at Pedro Miguel, which lowers ships to the Miraflores Lake. The single-stage locks at Pedro Miguel lowers ships 31 feet to Miraflores Lake. At the end of Miraflores Lake are the 2-stage Miraflores locks, which lower ships 52 feet to sea level at the Pacific terminus in the Bay of Panama. Here is an off-air view of the profile of the canal. The continental divide is at an elevation of 312 feet.
This shows in more detail the Atlantic end of the canal, with the 3-stage Gatun locks that raise ships a total of 85 feet to the level of Gatun Lake. The ships then traverse Gatun Lake for a distance of 32 miles to the exit of Gamboa. Then there is the passage through the Gaillard Cut, formerly known as the Gaillard Cut. This cut traverses the continental divide and is the highest terrain along the entire route of the canal.
After the Gaillard Cut are the Pedro Miguel locks to lower ships 31 feet to the level of Miraflores Lake.
Finally, the 2-stage Miraflores locks lower ships a final 52 feet to sea level at the Pacific Ocean end of the canal, near Panama City.
This shows the entire extent of the canal from Atlantic to Pacific. A typical passage through the canal by a cargo ship takes around 9 hours. 14,000 vessels pass through the canal every year, making an average of almost 40 per day, with a total capacity of 280 million tons.
This cross-section again shows the route of a ship through the Panama Canal. From the Atlantic Ocean, a ship is raised 85 feet through 3 sets of locks to the level of Gatun Lake. The ship then travels through the lake and Gaillard Cut, the narrowest section of the canal. It is then lowered through a lock to Miraflores Lake, and passes through 2 more locks before reaching the Pacific Ocean.
A trip along the canal from its Atlantic entrance would take you through a 7-mile dredged channel in Limon Bay. The canal then proceeds for a distance of 11.5 miles to the Gatun locks. This series of 3 locks raise ships 85 feet to Gatun Lake.
The Panama Canal continues south through a channel in Gatun Lake for 32 miles to Gamboa. where the Culebra Cut begins. At the end of this cut are the locks at Pedro Miguel. The Pedro Miguel locks lower ships 31 feet to Miraflores Lake, which then takes you to the Miraflores locks, which lower ships 52 feet to sea level at the Pacific terminus of the canal in the Bay of Panama.
Altogether, the Panama Canal consists of 17 artificial lakes, several improved and artificial channels, and 3 sets of locks. An additional artificial lake, Alajuela Lake, acts as a reservoir for the canal. A trip along the canal from its Pacific entrance near Panama City would take you to the 2-stage locks which raise ships 52 feet from sea level to Miraflores Lake. Then, after a short trip across Miraflores Lake, the Pedro Miguel locks raise ships 31 feet to the level of the Gaillard Cut in Gatun Lake. Then after an 8-mile trip through the Gaillard Cut, the ship reaches the wide expanse of Gatun Lake. Then after a 32-mile trip across Gatun Lake, the ships reach the Gatun Locks. The Gatun Locks are a series of 3 locks that lower ships 85 feet to sea level. The canal then proceeds for a distance of 11.5 miles to a 7-mile dredged channel in Limon Bay to the Atlantic Ocean.
The Panama Canal was constructed in 2 stages. The first, between 1881 and 1888, was the work carried out by the French company headed by Ferdinand de Lesseps. The second stage was the work by the Americans, which eventually completed the canal's construction between 1904 and 1914.
Panama Canal Timeline, 1515-Gold and El Camino Real.
The strategic location of the Isthmus of Panama, and the short distance between the oceans there, have prompted many attempts over the centuries to forge a trading route between the oceans.
Spanish explorer Vasco Núñez de Balboa was the first European to cross the dense, rain-forested, and hilly terrain of the Isthmus of Panama and see the Pacific Ocean. Long before the canal, the Isthmus of Panama was an important route for the transshipment of gold and silver from the mines of Bolivia, Peru and Ecuador.
Beginning in the 1530s, the people and natural resources of the Americas were repeatedly exploited by foreign conquistadors, first from Spain, and later from Portugal. These competing colonial nations claimed the land and resources as their own, and divided it into colonies.
Spain was primarily interested in riches, gold and silver from its colonies in the New World.
The Spanish conquest of South America started in the north, and then went south along the west coast. The main interest in this region was finding riches, gold and silver in particular. The gold and silver riches of the Inca Empire drew the Spanish conquistadors down to Peru. Lima became the most important Spanish colonial city in the area. Then the discovery of the fabulously rich silver deposits of the Cerro Rico, or Rich Hill, at Potosi, in present-day Bolivia, added to this interest.
The main trade route was north, up the coast to Panama, and then across to the Caribbean and the Atlantic Ocean to Spain. King Philip III ordered that the trade route in South America should go up the west coast through Lima to Panama, and thence across to Isthmus to the Caribbean, and on to Spain.
Trade from Lima and across Panama to Cadiz in Spain took close to 6 months.
A complete round-trip exchange between Lima and Spain could take an entire year.
Construction of a canal was far beyond the engineering technology of Balboa's time. But roads quickly sprang up to support portage between cargo ships.
A trail crossing the isthmus that had been used by the natives for centuries was discovered in 1515. It was improved and paved by the Spaniards, and became El Camino Real.
Although all of the early schemes involved a land route linking ports on either coast, speculation on a possible canal goes back to the earliest days of European exploration of Panama. Spain once pondered building a Panama Canal. Should the canal be built or not? It must have seemed logical to see what the Bible had to say about such a project. After consulting with his religious advisors, who reminded him of the scriptural warning, "What God has joined together let no man put asunder,"
King Philip II declared that to seek or make known any better route than the one from Portobello to Panama is forbidden under penalty of death.
Panama Canal timeline, 1848. The California Gold Rush. El Camino Real lasted many years, and was even used in the 1840s by gold prospectors heading for the California Gold Rush.
The route saw its greatest overland use following the gold rushes that began in California in 1848. The wagon train trip from the east to the west coast of the United States was fraught with danger and took 6 months. Traveling by ship around South America's Cape Horn was nearly as dangerous and took 2 to 4 months.
By taking a ship to Panama, crossing at the Isthmus, and again setting out by ship on the Pacific, the ND trip took little more than a month.
This advertises a time of only 35 days.
Panama Canal timeline 1850 to 1855. Panama Railway was built. By the 19th century it was becoming clear that a cheaper and faster alternative was required. Given the difficulty of constructing a canal with the available technology, a railway seemed the ideal solution. By the middle of the century, several factors turned in favor of a link: the acquisition of the southwestern U.S. at the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848.
And the increasing movement of settlers to the west coast created a demand for a fast route between the oceans,
which was fueled even further by the discovery of gold in California.
The Panama Railway was built across the Isthmus from 1850 to 1855, running 47 miles from Colón, on the Atlantic coast, to Panama City on the Pacific. The Panama Railway crosses the Wild Chagres River at several points. This is a Canal Zone postage stamp, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Panama Railroad in 1955.
The project was an engineering marvel of its age, carried out in brutally difficult conditions. It is estimated that more than 12,000 people died in its construction, many of them from cholera and malaria.
Until the opening of the Panama Canal, the railway carried the heaviest volume of freight per unit length of any railroad in the world. The existence of the railway was key in the selection of Panama as the site of the canal.
The construction of the Panama Railroad foreshadowed many of the difficulties faced by the builders of the canal. Between 1850 and 1855, it is estimated that about 40% of rail workers died from diseases such as yellow fever.
The rail line would carry thousands of passengers per year, until the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. The Panama Canal Railroad still operates today, carrying mostly container freight.
This shows the original and present route of the Panama Railroad.
A number of surveys were carried out between 1850 and 1875 for a canal route. The conclusion was that the two most favorable routes were those across Panama, then a part of Colombia, and across Nicaragua, with a route across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Mexico as a third option. The Nicaragua route was seriously considered and surveyed since the days of Ain and Cortez. The Tehuantepec Isthmus has been considered a favorable route, first for an interoceanic canal, and since the 19th century full an interoceanic railway.
The proximity of the Tehuantepec Isthmus to the access of international trade gives it some advantage over the Panama Route. However, the Isthmus of Panama is significantly narrower, making for a shorter traversal. The great cost of a canal across the isthmus compelled engineers and capitalists to give it up as impracticable. Nevertheless, James Beades proposed to construct a quadruple-track ship railway, and the scheme received serious attention for some time.
This shows the route of edge ship-carrying railroad across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. The French project.
The French project, a canal before its time.
After the successful completion of the Suez Canal in 1869, the French were inspired to tackle the apparently similar project to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, and it were confident that this could be carried out with little difficulty. In 1876, an international company, La Société Internationale du Canal Interoceanique, was created to undertake the work. 2 years later it obtained a concession from the Colombian government, which then controlled the land, to dig a canal across the isthmus. Ferdinand de Lesseps, who was in charge of the construction of the Suez Canal, was the figurehead of the scheme.
His enthusiastic leadership, coupled with his reputation as the man who had brought the Suez project to a successful conclusion, persuaded speculators and ordinary citizens to invest in the scheme, ultimately almost $400 million.
De Lesseps' success at Suez made him confident, perhaps too confident, that the canal at Panama would be no different.
As de Lesseps proceeded to convince his countrymen of a similar success for a Panama Canal, stock for his new company, the Compagnie Universelle du Canal Interoceanique, was sold.
However, the company only managed to raise 8% of what de Lesseps had hoped for, just 30 million francs of his requested 400 million francs. De Lesseps, despite his previous success, was not an engineer. The construction of the Suez Canal in 1869 was essentially that of a ditch dug through a flat, sandy desert and presented few challenges.
Panama, however, was to be very different and much more difficult. De Lesseps believed that if a sea-level canal worked when constructing the Suez Canal, it must work for the Panama Canal. The French efforts to build a canal were doomed to costly failure for two principal reasons. Surveyors and most engineers recognized the difficulty of the terrain, including its rocky elevation changes, and recommended the construction of a canal with tunnels and locks. However, French leadership insisted on the simplicity of a sea-level design. As with the successful French-made Suez Canal, the mountainous spine of Central America comes to a low point at Panama, but still rises to a height of 360 feet above sea level at the lowest crossing point.
A sea-level canal, as proposed by de Lesseps, would require a prodigious excavation through the varied hardness of the rock rather than the easy sand of Suez. The sea-level plan required significantly more digging, and also introduced the danger of flooding from the Chagres River, which in the tropical climate of Panama can receive up to 200 inches of rainfall per year. This meant it would take longer to complete the canal and further expose workers to disease, the second major cause of the French failure. A less obvious barrier was presented by the rivers crossing the canal, particularly the Chagres River, which flows very strongly in the rainy season.
This water could not simply be dumped into the canal, as it would present an extreme hazard to shipping. So, a sea-level canal would recue the river, which cuts right across the canal route, to be diverted. The most serious problem of all, however, was tropical diseases, particularly malaria and yellow fever.
Since it was unknown at the time how these diseases were contracted, any precautions against them were doomed to failure.
For example, the legs of the hospital beds we placed in tins of water to keep insects from crawling up. But these pans of stagnant water made ideal breeding places for mosquitoes, the carriers of these two diseases, and so worsened the problem. From the beginning, the project was plagued by a lack of engineering expertise. In May 1879, an International Engineering Congress was convened in Paris, with Ferdinand de Lesseps at its head.
Of the 136 delegates, however, only 42 were engineers, the others being made up of speculators, politicians, and personal friends of de Lesseps.
De Lesseps was convinced that a sea-level canal, dug through the mountainous, rocky spine of Central America, could be completed as easily as, or even more easily than, the Suez Canal.
The Engineering Congress estimated the cost of the project at $214 million. An engineering commission later revised this estimate to $168,600,000. De Lesseps twice reduced this estimate, with no apparent justification, first to $131,600,000, and then to $120 million. The Engineering Congress estimated 7 or 8 years as the time required to complete the workday. Lesseps reduced the time to 6 years, as compared to the 10 years required for the Suez Canal. De Lesseps was unfamiliar with conditions in Panama, and was unwilling to acknowledge that they were vastly different from Suez. This proposal for a sea-level canal was protested strongly by Adolphe Gaudin de l'Épinay, Baron de Brucely, an engineer who had studied the isthmus in detail.
In 1879, l'Épinay proposed a practical plan for building a canal. This was to build dams to create a huge lake, and use locks to raise and lower the ships,
so that they can float across the continental divide. L'Épinay's conception eventually established him as an architectural and engineering genius, and as the originator of the plan from which the Panama Canal was eventually built. Unfortunately for the French, however, his idea was ignored at the time, and the Compagnie Universelle embarked on its ill-fated undertaking.
De Lesseps was unfamiliar with conditions in Panama, and was unwilling to acknowledge that they were vastly different from Suez.
Unlike the arid desert of the Isthmus of Suez, Panama was a tropical jungle, with tremendous rains, debilitating heat and humidity, and tropical diseases.
Topographic conditions along the proposed route varied considerably and ranged from coastal marshes to the mountains of the Continental Divide.
Despite competent engineering, there was no sound overall plan. Machinery used to dig the canal was either too light or ill-suited for the tough inland terrain, and disease took a terrible toll in workers' lives.
Panama Canal timeline 1880. The French work begins.
Construction of the canal began on January 1, 1880. A huge labor force was assembled. By 1888, this numbered about 20,000 men, 9/10 of these being Afro-Caribbean workers from the West Indies.
Although extravagant rewards were given to French engineers who joined the canal effort, the huge death toll from disease made it difficult to retain them. The French engineers either left after short service, or died. The total death toll between 1881 and 1889 was estimated at over 22,000.
In 1883 it was realized there was a tidal range of 20 feet at the Pacific, whereas the Atlantic range was only about 1 foot. It was concluded that this difference in levels would be a danger to navigation.
It was proposed that a tidal lock should be constructed at Panama to preserve the level from Fetsu. This plan would save about 13 million cubic yards of excavation.
The rocky ground of the formerly volcanic area proved to be too much for the French steam shovels and dredges. Headway was made only when a plan for dynamiting the rocks underwater and dredging up the pieces was put forth by Philippe Bonaventura, who was later to become one of the most influential individuals in the United States' interest in the canal.
After 5 years of digging, in 1885, it had become clear to many that a sea-level canal was impractical,
and that an elevated canal with locks was the best answer. However, de Lesseps was stubborn, and it was not until October 1887 that the lock canal plan was adopted. The French company started to face financial difficulties in 1885 and even applied to the French government to issue lottery bonds.
Under the wet conditions, dirt and mud would slide back into the newly dug canal track before it could be shored up. Problems mounted, and by 1887, the French engineers admitted that the sea-level canal could not be built, instead agreeing to a lock construction to meet the rocky elevation at the continental divide at Culebra.
1888 the French effort ended. It was a work before its time. A sea-level canal instead of a lock type, tropical diseases, and inadequate equipment. Attempts at further financing failed, and the company collapsed in 1889. And virtually ceased to function by 1898. Any possibility of completing the canal across Panama was gone, and the only hope was holding together an enterprise that could be offered for sale. In the end, less than half of the excavation made by the French was used in the U.S. canal.
It soon became clear that the only way to salvage anything for the stockholders was to continue the project. A new concession was obtained from Colombia, and in 1894, the company Nouvelle du Canal de Panama was created to finish the construction.
The new effort never really gathered momentum. The main reason for this was the speculation by the United States over a canal built through Nicaragua, which would render Panama Canal useless. The company started looking for a buyer, with a price tag of $100 million.
Meanwhile, in the U.S., the Isthmus and Canal Commission was established in 1899 to examine the possibilities of a Central American canal, and to recommend a route.
In 1901 the Commission reported that a U.S. canal should be built through Nicaragua unless the French were willing to sell out at $40 million. The French company was practically forced to sell for that amount, or get nothing.
The reasons behind the French failure to complete the project were due to disease-carrying mosquitoes, the inadequacy of their machinery, and the initial attempt to build a sea-level type of canal.
It was a canal before its time. The state-of-the-art of engineering, science, and technology in the 1880s was simply not up to the task.
This is the old French cemetery in Preface, where over 20,000 persons are buried. Panama Canal Timeline. 1515 El Camino Real. 1848 California Gold Rush. 1850 to 1855 Panama Railway built. 1880 French work begins. 1888 French effort ends. 1903 Independence of Panama from Colombia. 1904 Americans begin digging. 1914 Canal completed.
Table of Contents. The Panama Canal.
Thanks for watching. Please watch some more of my great videos.